Good afternoon. It's my honor to be here. I'm happy to be before a scientific audience so I can really get to the data. I have a lot to get through, so I'm going to jump in. I wouldn't dare to predict specifically where your field is going. From my perspective, uncertainty is by definition means you don't know the future. If we could predict the future, we could invent tomorrow's inventions today. What I do know a lot about, have thought a lot about, I'm going to talk about, is how human beings react to uncertainty. I like these two quotes. I like the contrast between them because they're thematic. As one psychologist told me, people come alive when the world breaks down. Get to my definitions. Ambiguity is something that is unclear because information is either missing, contradictory, or too complicated. And uncertainty is the mind state that we feel when we are encountering ambiguity. You'll find different definitions depending on the field or subfield. That's the one I prefer. The question I get often is, well, is uncertainty good or bad? I was writing a column, or pitching a column to an editor once on the psychology of nostalgia. And she said, "This is great, Jamie. We're definitely going to run this, but I have to know, are you for or against nostalgia?" Which I didn't think was a very good question. So obviously, uncertainty is good or bad. Depends on what we're talking about. I think it's interesting that a lot of the places that we find greatest pleasure involve what I would say are safe simulations of uncertainty. So crossword puzzles, the clue is fire. Do we mean ardor? Do we mean terminate? Do we mean shoot? Music plays with consonance and dissonance. Sports, obviously, a lot of the pleasure is not knowing what's going to happen. Tourism, going to a new place. Discovery, by definition, means dwelling in and exploring uncertainty. And romance, some of the pleasure of meeting people, and it's kind of like going on a journey itself. I think it speaks to the power of uncertainty, the power of ambiguity, that the most popular literary genre of all time, which is the detective story, gets its power really from maintaining ambiguity between suspects. And you're playing with the clues, and this person did it, and you're going to go over there. Modern art, this is what $58 million worth of ambiguity looks like. Yes. Jeff Koons. When is it unpleasant? A lot of times it's unpleasant at work. You have a deadline, you have a budget, you don't know you're going to make the budget or not, the deadline. Health. My knee hurts. The doctor can't tell me exactly what it is. Trust judgments. Do you trust someone or not? Trade-off decisions. You have a certain amount of money. Again, it gets back to budgets. You need to buy medicine and school supplies. You don't know if you can afford both. And discovery and romance are on there also. You can go down a wrong end when you're discovering something. You know, it can be very thrilling, but you can also go down the wrong path, waste 6 months, waste a year. And when romance goes sour, it can also be unpleasant. In either case, whether it's positive or negative, uncertainty amplifies our emotions and, in fact, our opinions, which I will get to, in ways that we do not predict. So it makes pleasure more pleasurable than it normally would be. It makes anxiety more agonizing. And there's a great study that shows this from Gilbert and Wilson, psychologists at Harvard and University of Virginia, in which they brought people into the lab and they divided subjects into two groups. And one group, they said, you're going to get 2 gifts for sure at the end of this task, which didn't matter. And the other group, they said, you're going to get either 1 gift or 2 gifts. That was the uncertain condition. And it turned out that the people who didn't know whether they were going to get 1 or 2 gifts were significantly happier. And they didn't predict this. Only 20% of the subjects would have chosen the uncertain condition. They also did one on romantic attraction where they showed women Facebook pictures and they told some that the man likes you a lot. They told another group the man likes you a lot or a moderate amount. And in this study, women found the men who they weren't sure they liked them 5 times more attractive, which seems excessive to me. Whether the ambiguity is good or bad, what I want to emphasize is that we are working to resolve it. our minds are consistency machines. There's a psychologist named Jordan Peterson, and he says the need to manage complexity and reduce it looms above all other psychological concerns, both because there's so much information and because it's the way we learn, identifying anomalies and resolving them. And there's a great text which gets to how aggressively our minds are reducing ambiguity. I would just let you read this for 10 seconds here. I find it remarkable that we can read this. You can see what they've done here is they've just kept the first and last letter, and they've scrambled up the middle of the words. It turns out there was no study at Cambridge University. This was put online as a hoax in 2003, although it is now referred to as the Cambridge University effect in academic papers. Whoever the hoaxer was made their point. Now we can get to the main kind of construct. For my money, it's the best construct dealing with uncertainty. There are 15 others for unimportant reasons, but this is the best one. It was developed by a psychologist named Aryeh Kruglansky in 1993, cited in 94. And here are 5 examples of what this scale measures. This is a 15-question scale. What you would do is you would rate yourself as 1, strongly disagree, all the way up to 6, strongly agree. You would total that up, and the lower score you get, you would have a lower need for closure. So on a 15-question scale, it would be from 15 to 90. This is not always a bad thing, having a high need for closure, nor does it reflect a particular political ideology, but there are cases in which a high need for closure can get you into trouble, which I will talk about. I want to step back quickly, briefly I should say, and put the need for closure in the context of sense-making, because then it will enrich the concept. If you just, and to do that, I'm going to go to a psychologist named Travis Prue, who is basing his work on Jean Piaget in part, who's a psychologist in the Netherlands. Actually, he's now was at University of Tilburg. He's now in the UK. And Prue is building a taxonomy of how we react to uncertainty. And his first 2 reactions, based on Jean Piaget's work, he's a Swiss clinical psychologist who did interviews with children some years ago. And the first 2 reactions are assimilation and accommodation. You may know them. Assimilation is when we extend a concept we already have. I know what a tree is. That's a tree. Accommodation is when we are changing the way we see the world conceptually. So a nice example is if you see an albino crow, assimilation would be, that's a dove. I recognize that. And accommodation would be, well, the eyes are a little red, so are the feet. I think that's an albino crow. I've never seen that before. What makes this picture particularly interesting is that, as Stephen Hine told me, assimilation is so often incomplete. That is, we think we've got something, we think we have a category or a grip on some piece of information, but the idea that we don't quite have it is still there in our minds, and it turns out in our bodies. And what Prue is interested in is what are the spillover effects of that kind of uncertainty, these extra uncertainties that we cannot resolve. A lot of the uncertainties in our lives can't be resolved. And how do we react to those? Let's see if okay. So they induce uncertainty among subjects in a bunch of different ways, 6 or 7 different experimental interventions. This is one of them. They are flashing these nonsense word pairs to subjects more quickly than the conscious mind can perceive. And they have ways of confirming that that's the case. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to test what happens when we feel some uncertainty, but it's below the level of consciousness and we can't resolve it. And what they find is several additional reactions. In this particular experiment, after they exposed people to these nonsense word pairs, they showed them letter strings, 4 letters that were a random string, and actually some of these letter strings had hidden patterns in them, and they said, identify as many patterns as you see in these strings, and if you were exposed to nonsense word pairs as opposed to word pairs that made sense, you saw more patterns. So you became pattern hungry as a reaction to this unconscious uncertainty. Prue calls this abstraction. Another effect is affirmation. And so you would do this kind of intervention, or in another experiment, he had people read Kafka beforehand. In another experiment, he had people argue against something that they believed to be true. In another experiment, he had them argue or conceive of themselves as two different people. These are all ways to make people feel uncertain. And if you gave them an opportunity, rather than looking at things like these letter strings, people would affirm their beliefs more ardently than they normally would, no matter what their beliefs were. So, for example, if you believed in God and they made you feel uncertain in an experiment, you would express that belief even more strongly. If you were a liberal and believed and were pro-immigration, you would be even more pro-immigrant, or if you were against immigration, you would be even more opposed. So it is polarizing. That's affirmation. We fall back on the beliefs, whatever those beliefs are. They did an experiment where even belief in Darwin's theory of evolution became more dogmatic after you made people feel uncertain. Relevant to the deluge of information online, there's a very clever experiment that showed people contradictory information about vaccine efficacy, and same result depending on how you came in. If you were pro-vaccine and read these contradictory messages, you became even more, and if you were opposed, you became even more opposed. We will get to creativity in a second. Let's see what I have here. Oh, so you may have guessed that one of the interesting things about the experiments I'm describing is that what we affirm does not have to be related in content to what is violated. The source of the uncertainty can be unrelated to our reaction to it. So they showed people this painting, and they showed another group landscape paintings. And after seeing this Magritte painting, people described a greater need for order in their lives than they normally would. My favorite example of an experiment that just shows just how unrelated our compensatory reactions to uncertainty is this slide doesn't really relate to it, but it's cute. They had subjects eat an unexpectedly bitter chocolate, after which they described a greater need for meaning in their lives. Which is fantastic. It turns out, so another thing Prue has been doing is showing how this works mechanistically. And it turns out that there is a slight aversive physical arousal, which is pushing this uncertainty reduction, pushing this need for closure. He's based a lot of this on Leon Festinger, who described this cognitive dissonance, and he's been proving that cognitive dissonance has a physiological basis. There's an older experiment that shows this, but I'm going to include it because it's a fun one. In the 70s, these psychologists took skydivers, and they brought them up on airplanes. They took another group of skydivers, and they interviewed them on the ground, and they showed them these pictures. And they said, see what kind of patterns you see and describe. And if you were on the airplane, these skydivers saw far more patterns than if you were on the ground. So it's the abstraction. This is not really even an uncertainty that they're confronting. It's the slight buzz that they're getting because they're about to jump out of an airplane. More directly, in the last, I would say, 3 years, they've done a bunch of experiments with aspirin, showing that you can get rid of these effects, these compensatory effects, if you give people an aspirin. It is getting rid of this physiological arousal, and it is eliminating these compensatory effects. So now I'm ready to explain how an unrelated stress can piggyback on how we are reacting to ambiguous information. Back to the need for closure, this is Kruglanski again, and he did a very famous experiment where he brought subjects into the lab. He had pairs of people. They were there to debate a hypothetical legal case. A plane had crashed in a forest and burned down some trees, and an airliner was suing a timber company. And these subjects were to assign guilt. In one condition, the subjects were given an expert briefing beforehand in favor of either the airline or the lumber company. That was the certain condition. In another, they were given no such expert brief. There was 2 tricks to the experiment. The first was that one of the people arguing was actually what you call a confederate, working for Kruglanski, pretending to be an experimental subject, who had been advised to argue against whatever the real subject was arguing. And the second twist was that they had a noisy printer going on in the background, printing 1,000 pages. Just a little slight irritant, a little physical stress in the background. And I find the results fantastic here. So if they were calm, by which I mean there was no printer going, it didn't matter if they had the expert information at the beginning of the experiment. It took about 6 minutes for the pairs to agree with each other. No significant difference between if they got the brief or not. When they were stressed, when the printer was going, 3 minutes and 50 seconds to agree if they had not gotten the expert brief beforehand. If they had gotten the expert brief, it took 7 minutes and fewer agreed. So what's happening is that under a slight additional stress in the background, people are more eager to get out of uncertainty. And depending on whether they had prior knowledge or not, they're escaping in two different ways. One is they're just deferring to the person that they're arguing with. Fine, I agree. I don't want to talk about this. And the other is that they're becoming dogmatic. Kruglanski calls these urgency and permanence. We want to get out of uncertainty more when we have a higher need for closure. And permanence, we want to stick to it. If these sound quite a bit like Prou's concepts of abstraction and affirmation, is because they are the same. Let's see here. So now I can kind of add to the picture of need for closure what began as a study of our dispositional levels, that is, all of our individual characteristic dislike for uncertainty as a baseline. It began as a study of a character trait. Became and grew into a study of situational need for closure. So we all have this baseline level, and then stresses throughout the day, going up and down, are making us more open or closed-minded, making us more or less comfortable with uncertainty, and raising all of our need for closure above whatever our baseline is. Let's see, where are we here? Okay. There's a study that came out a few months ago that showed that the higher your need for closure is, the more averse you are to adopting an innovative technology. This is the first study to link NFC to our new technology adoption. Who we decide to trust and distrust, as you can imagine from what I've discussed, it polarizes our trust judgments. So if we know someone, we trust them more than we normally would. If we don't know them, we trust them even less than we normally would. Hiring decisions. It turns out they've done a number of experiments where if you have a high need for closure or your need for closure is raised situationally, you jump on early information in an interview and you ignore later information. Whether we were wrong, that's dogmatism. Perceived threats, a high need for closure has been linked to a support for secret prisons and the idea that security is more important than individual liberty. And whether we stereotype and tend towards conspiracy. This is the extreme of jumping to conclusions, of being pattern hungry, of reducing to prototype. And we will get to how to reduce the need for closure. So the picture I've been painting is you have uncertainty in general, leading to a thirst for certainty in general, and it doesn't have to be related in content. So Bush's popularity tracks up and down with DHS's color-coded threat warning. The best part of that study is that, in fact, Americans' approval of Bush's handling of the economy also tracked up and down with the threat warning. Totally unrelated. And according to Prue, perhaps up to 60% of human behavior involves these kinds of compensatory strategies. Creativity. There's a whole large set of literature, a lot of it by Dean Simonton, about experiences that push us out of our normal realm of experience. He calls these diversifying experiences. This aids cognitive flexibility. I'll talk about how in a second. He did a wonderful study of historical Japan in which he broke down centuries into 20-year segments. And he found that openness to outside influences, immigrants, travel abroad, was correlated to a much higher creative output 40 years later. So children who had these experiences became more creative. And this kind of parallels this idea that art is made during periods of social upheaval. There's a lot of evidence that individual artistic achievement comes from the artist having to experiences that they are trying to reconcile. In fact, even artistic genres, John Gardner, one of my favorite writing teachers, he talks about the invention of a new genre being a combination of two genres that you like. So Poe invents the detective story because he likes true crime and he likes puzzles. There's a theory of dramatic suspense, that in fact suspense is the artist working out their conflicts, their questions in the guise of plot and character. And as the psychologist told me, one of the sources of creativity is when the ambiguity wins. This is the #1 restaurant in America where this chef has decided to get rid of plates. He said he didn't want to be confined by the size of a standard plate. So now you have very expensive chocolate swirls. Scientific creativity. It's the same thing with artistic creativity. A lot of some of this, of course, is brain drain. We're a great place to live, so scientists want to come and live here. 52% of foreign-born, second-generation citizens among distinguished U.S. mathematicians. Higher percentage also of patents, Nobel laureates. And this is a great study. Between 1985 and 2009, these scientists took 1.5 million papers. They found that they analyzed them by geographic diversity, so how far away the authors were, where they lived. And they found the farther away that the authors lived, the better the papers were, and the more citations the papers had, which is a great study. Let's see where we are here. Okay. How could this be? How could a diversifying experience living abroad aid creativity? How could it work? Here's one example of how it might work. There's a great study by Carl Duncker, this is 1925, in which he brought subjects into his lab and he had 3 boxes on a table. One had candles, the other had matches, the other had tacks. And he said, please affix these candles to the door for visual experiments. It's not what it was for, but that was the setup. Another group of his subjects came in and the candles were aside the boxes, as were the tacks, as were the matches. So people tried to light the candles and stick them on the door. People tried to take the tacks and affix them to the door. The solution, of course, was to dump the tacks out of the box, use the box as a tray, and put the candle in it. Now, most people didn't think of that unless they came in and the box was aside the tacks, because the current function of the box obscured its potential function. And this is a fantastic experiment. Just thinking about time you have lived abroad made people better at solving this problem. So what seems to be happening is that people are a little more flexible in terms of the categories, particularly in functions. A field I used to work in, international development, has some wonderful examples of this, of people seeing categories that we have assumptions about in new ways. There's a great story in the Philippines in which migrant workers are trying to send money back to their families in the countryside. They would have to come to the city. And normally it would take 16 hours. You'd have to take a bus ride, and you'd waste time. You could give it to someone. They might spend some of the money. No one knows who figured out a solution, but someone around 1998 figured out a better way to transfer money. And this was by using airtime cards. This is where you have a phone plan in which you buy a little card. You get a number which you text to your provider, and they send you more airtime minutes. And what they figured out was they didn't have smartphones, but they had basic mobile phones. And they figured out that what you could do is text the code for the airtime minutes to their loved one in the countryside, who could then take that code unused and sell it to the local cigarette and soda vendor minus a small commission. So an SMS, which we would think of as a text message function, is actually a data channel. And there have been tons of innovations using SMS. And an airtime card is actually a virtual currency. And what's interesting here is that a lot of innovations in this area come from users on the ground, I think because they don't have the same categorical, let's say, stereotypes that the corporations might that later came in and monetized these discoveries. You might ask, is there a rule by which some people are becoming more dogmatic or more pattern hungry, and when they are becoming creative? No, there's no rule. It looks to me like people who tend towards scientific or artistic creativity make a habit of it, are slightly more introverted, whereas other people may have these spillover uncertainty, this extra energy, may find a social output. The second question is, what is the right amount of dissonance? If we were trying to cultivate this energy or harness this positive uncertainty. And there's a great study by Adam Galinsky, he's at Columbia University, where he looked at 11 years of data on fashion brands. And it turns out the top executives that have lived abroad had much more creative designs. But they had to immerse themselves in the culture. So there was a kind of a sweet spot of cultural distance where, if it's too far, you can imagine if you go to Afghanistan, you're not going to assimilate with that culture. And if it's too close, it may not be exciting. So for Americans, Canada may not be exciting enough. Maybe Paris is the right amount of dissonance, this perfect sweet spot of dissonance. How do we deal with, how do we lower our need for closure? I'm going to skip that quote, but I promise you there's an amazing joke about it. In experimental settings, psychologists lower people's need for closure by reminding them of the stakes. They say you're going to have to defend your decision later on. They say you're going to be accountable for your decision, and they remind them of the consequences. Now, that's maybe easier said than done, but we can do this when we face uncertainty. We can formalize reminders. And for my money, the takeaway is really think about, are there any additional stresses that could be piggybacking on my natural need for closure and raising my need for closure, making me jump to conclusions that might be unwarranted, making me agree with someone faster than I normally would, or making me more dogmatic. Two other ways to lower our need for closure, make us better at dealing with uncertainty, maybe surprisingly: fiction. So reading short stories, again in an experimental setting, lowered people's need for closure. This was true especially for habitual readers. Also made people more empathetic. And multicultural experiences. There's some great experiments showing that just having people remember a time they'd been abroad or met friends from different cultures or listened to a different kind of music or had a different kind of a food lowered their need for closure. Similar interventions also led to less discriminatory hiring. There's a great 2012 study in which they brought in white subjects and they exposed them to either American culture, Chinese culture, or a mix of American and Chinese culture. And this was done by showing them slides of architecture and or movies or art or cuisine or home decorations. One group got just the American culture, one group got just Chinese, and one got a mix. Afterwards, they were asked to make hiring decisions. They got a bunch of resumes, and some were low quality, some were high quality, and some of the resumes had white-sounding names and some had African American-sounding names. So when subjects were exposed just to American culture, you see the low-quality resumes, it didn't make much of a difference. But for the high-quality resumes, you see the clear bias in judging the quality. Same thing happened when it's just Chinese culture. Again, low quality didn't matter. When the subjects were exposed to two different cultures simultaneously, that's an older slide. The actual slide shows them lining up perfectly. So in essence, the bias disappears. Now, that doesn't mean that you should eat Tex-Mex food before you hire someone, but I think it's a strong example of the kind of intervention or the kind of thinking that snaps us out of this aggressive mode of characterization. What can we do to get better, to help students get better with uncertainty? Yes, we can help them fail better. Yes, we can have them argue unfamiliar positions. We can talk a little differently about how fluid knowledge is. I think the emphasis should be on getting used to confusion, making people more comfortable with being confused, rather than it being a social threat. As I mentioned, a lot of the places where we enjoy uncertainty is when it's safe. Fiction is safe. We're at home, we're reading a book. The perfect amount of dissonance, right? If a culture is too different, it's threatening. And so it turns out when we're in a bad mood, we gravitate toward the familiar, but a good mood, when we're feeling safe, we're much more likely to venture out into the unknown and try new things. And of course, you want people to treat confusion as a signal. Okay, there's something here that I can learn, and not as a threat. I'm going to end with another jarring contrast. We've got John Wayne and Chekhov. I don't trust ambiguity, like I don't trust Native Americans. This is all of us. We are reductionists. We are stereotypers. We are reducing things to prototype. We have to be. But we can cultivate the opposite habits. I love this quote from Chekhov. He says, "You are determined to categorize me. I am none of your categories. I'm not a liberal. I'm not a conservative. I see the same kinds of weaknesses among all sectors of society." And if you read his stories, he is judging his characters not by what they know, but their relationship to uncertainty. How curious are they? How strict are they, both when dealing with new information and when imposing their ideas on other people? And how deferential? Do they just give away their thought or their consideration to someone else and defer? And I think these three characteristics of curiosity and intellectual humility and independence are, despite the John Wayne Chekhov contrast, deeply democratic, and I hope they are deeply American. Thank you for your time.